Hey guys, my name's Mannequin and welcome back to EDM Pro Tips. Today's episode is kind of simple, kind of like, what this whole series is supposed to be. But the whole idea today is try to do a project where you don't EQ. And I don't mean like a full track that you plan on releasing. I mean just like start a new project, kind of like to experiment, just to try to mess around and try out this one thing. Try not to EQ any of your tracks. And the reason I say this is because a lot of you producers have trouble with EQ, or they EQ too much. And what I mean by have trouble with EQ is either A, they don't know what they're supposed to be doing, or B, they think they're doing it right, but they're doing it wrong. And then too much EQ also, you could think that you're doing EQ right, but you're like doing extreme EQ curves to try to get things to work right, and you're just like doing massive boosts and cuts, and you're pretty much killing the original sound, which is good for stylistic things, but not good for mixing. So my suggestion today is don't EQ in a track, just for an experiment. Just try to give it a shot. And what this does, it allows you to focus on the other important aspects of mixing, notably compression and probably primarily volume levels. Because when you do not have control over your EQ, it's a lot more about finding tracks and finding where they sit by using volume. Compression is kind of more like getting them to stand out when they need to stand out, and be in the background when they need to be in the background, kind of smooth things out or makes things punch a bit more. So it's not so much of a balance as EQ normally is. EQ is normally about slotting things in, but if you think about it, volume is just kind of like the simple one-band version of an EQ. So just taking EQ out and using volume puts a lot more emphasis on getting the volume levels right, which it's like very underrated how important that is. I talked to a lot of mix engineers, not a lot of mix engineers, probably like 3 or 4 that I've actually talked to and have told me this. And other ones I see all over the internet are saying this. But they say that the most important part of a mix is getting the volume levels right. And you don't hear anyone talking about it because, like I've said in some of my other videos, it's taken for granted. If your track does not have good volume levels, it's just kind of like a bad track. Things step on things that they shouldn't be stepping on, and it doesn't really feel cohesive. So, so volume levels are very often taken for granted, and you don't really put enough emphasis on them. And because it's a really easy tool to use, there's louder and quieter, so there's like not much explanation you could do. It's almost entirely about listening closely and finding out, A, what you want, and B, what the track needs. What you want being, for my particular style, I want this to be louder than if I was doing, if I was trying to be this person and do what they do. For instance, you might like your hi-hats really up front and kind of like and present and very there, where other people might like them in the background, just kind of like something to move the track along a little. It's like that's a stylistic decision. And then as for what is needed, for example, you almost don't ever want the kick drum to be drowned out. So you can't like let the kick drum fall behind. So really those two things you need to keep an eye on by way of volume. And it's just very important to get these things right. And it's hard to put enough emphasis on it if you have EQ at your disposal, because you could use EQ to kind of like adjust the volume in certain spots, and you don't really focus on individual track as a whole volume. So just try it out as an experiment project. Just open a new project, try something out, make something, just a draft, and then instead of putting any EQs on, try to get it as good as you could possibly get it with volumes and balance things out. And like when you think you're about to, I have to have an EQ for this, how about you try to like adjust the volume of some things around it? Like if you have, if something is drowned out in the mids, maybe you have some other synthesizer that has a lot of mids that you need to bring down. Maybe you could get different types of synthesizers to kind of split up the high end, low end, and mids, just like design the synthesizers that way, so you kind of balance those out without having to actually use an EQ. Just try out some of those things. I mean, using filters is kind of like, is different. Feel free to use filters to like cut low end or high end out altogether, because it's not as much about as like actually EQing something. Just like using a filter to roll off the highs or roll off the lows is kind of more just getting rid of something. It's not so much like EQing to balance. So feel free to use those, just like if you think you really need to. But for the most part, yeah, try this project. Just like try it without EQ. It'll really let you focus on on, like I said, getting the mix right using things other than EQ, because typically EQ gets way too much emphasis. And also, it'll let you focus more on creativity, because if you don't have EQ to spend all your time working on, and you spend a lot of time EQing usually, then you could spend that time instead being creative, and you will get burnt out as fast with the mix. So I hope you like this suggestion. I hope you try it out. It's a neat thing to try. I've only done it like once or twice, but it kind of gives you a different perspective on things. Sometimes I'll actually do it accidentally. Like I'll be drafting out a track, and I'll just have idea after idea after idea of what I should do with the track. I'm like, oh, I'll add this, and then I'll add this, and I'll add this. And in the end, I look through, and like one of my tracks has an EQ on it. None of the other ones have EQ. So really, when you're focusing on other things, EQ actually becomes secondary. And you find out that if you try this and you actually really work with it, you'll find out you actually don't need to use a lot of EQ if you start with a good sound that's like a good sample or a good instrument, and because then you could really let the original sound shine through, and you could just EQ it just a tiny bit when it needs it, or just EQ a small section when it needs it, and you don't have to worry about EQing everything to extremes. So yeah, like I said, try that out, give it a shot, see how it works, see how much you learn. You might be surprised how much you learn with that one, just because instead of just saying generally, oh, try to use less plugins, it's kind of like I'm choosing a specific one to tell you guys, pull this one out, because when you pull this one out, it makes a big difference in your entire workflow. Because there's a lot of emphasis placed on EQ and like EQing things right, and like how do you EQ things, and does the EQ sound good on this? Could it use more highs? There's so much emphasis put on that if you pull it out, you suddenly are forced to really practice and learn how to use the other tools. So that's it for this video. Hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next video.